Papa will starve me if I don't bring whiskey. The child trembled. The Modoc shared his last deer meat. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into our story. The winds howled through the open plains of the western frontier, biting at the skin and chilling the bones of anyone foolish enough to be caught outside. In the small, remote cabin at the edge of the wilderness, a young boy, no older than 12, stood trembling. His name was Billy, and his wide, tear-filled eyes were fixed on the small window through which the cold moonlight poured in. Billy's father, a grizzled and harsh man, had given him an impossible task. "Papa will starve me if I don't bring whiskey," he had said, his voice gruff with anger. "Get that whiskey, or I'll leave you to fend for yourself in this cold." The boy's hands shook as he clutched a worn leather pouch, empty, ready to be filled with whatever he could find. But Billy knew he was running out of time. The promise of whiskey was the only thing that kept his father from turning his back on him completely. But where could a child find whiskey in the dead of night in the wilderness? With no other options, Billy ventured into the dark, snow-covered forest. As he trudged through the snow, the weight of his father's words pressed heavily on him. He didn't know how he could survive out here on his own. His heart raced, and the cold air burned his lungs with each desperate breath. Hours passed, and the night seemed endless. That was when he saw a flicker of light in the distance, just ahead, beyond the trees. As he drew closer, the smell of wood smoke filled his nose, and he could see the outline of a small campfire. Near the fire, a lone figure sat, wrapped in a thick fur blanket, staring into the flames. The figure was a Modoc warrior, an older man with a stoic expression and eyes that seemed to have seen far too much. Billy hesitated, unsure whether he should approach. The Modoc people were known to be fierce warriors, and many settlers spoke of them with fear. But Billy was desperate. He stepped forward cautiously, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. "Excuse me, sir. I need help. My father, he says I must bring whiskey, or he'll let me starve." The Modoc warrior turned his head slowly, his sharp eyes studying Billy with a gaze that seemed to pierce through him. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Then, to Billy's surprise, the warrior rose to his feet and walked toward him. Without a word, the Modoc reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in animal skin. He handed it to Billy, the scent of dried venison and fresh meat wafting from it. "Take this," the warrior said in a gravelly voice. "It is not whiskey, but it will keep you alive. You do not need to follow your father's cruel words. A man must decide his own path." Billy's eyes widened with relief as he clutched the bundle to his chest. The warrior's actions were an unexpected act of kindness, a gift from a stranger who didn't know him, yet offered what he could. The Modoc's kindness was the only warmth Billy had felt all night. For a moment, the weight of his father's harsh command seemed to lift. The warrior's simple act of sharing his last meal with a starving boy was more than just an offering of food. It was a lifeline, a chance at survival, and, perhaps, a chance to change the course of his life. With the meat in hand and hope flickering in his heart, Billy turned and hurried back toward the cabin, knowing that this moment of mercy would forever shape his journey ahead. As Billy made his way back through the biting cold, clutching the bundle of meat tightly to his chest, the weight of the warrior's kindness began to settle in. He had never expected such a gesture from a man he had been taught to fear. The Modoc, a people often spoken of with dread by the settlers, had shown him nothing but mercy. The night was still, with only the sound of his breath and the crunch of snow beneath his feet. His heart pounded with a mixture of relief and confusion. How could a warrior, someone so feared, show such compassion? As the warmth of the meat seeped through the animal's skin, Billy's thoughts raced back to his father, the cruel words echoing in his mind. "Papa will starve me if I don't bring whiskey," he had said. But the Modoc's simple act of kindness made him question everything he had ever been told about strength and survival. He reached the cabin just before dawn, his hands still trembling from the cold and the emotional weight of what had just transpired. He could see the faint glow of the fire inside through the cracks in the cabin's walls. As he entered, His father's back was turned, busy tending to the fire. Billy could hear the harsh crackle of wood and the occasional curse under his breath. The sight of his father made Billy's stomach twist. He was still a young boy, unsure of how to confront the man who had always been his greatest source of fear. Billy's father had never been kind, always demanding more than the boy could give. The harsh winters, the scarcity of food, and the cruelty of the land had hardened him into a man who seemed incapable of mercy. Billy stepped forward, the meat still wrapped tightly in his hands. His father's eyes flicked toward him, his expression unreadable. "Where's the whiskey, boy?" he asked in a cold, low voice. Billy hesitated. The bundle of venison felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hands. "I couldn't find it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But I brought something better. The Modoc shared his last deer meat with me. It's enough to last for a while." His father's eyes narrowed, a deep, simmering anger flashing in his gaze. "What did you say?" he growled, his voice rising. "You brought meat instead of whiskey? You worthless child. What do you think I'm going to do with this?" Billy's heart pounded in his chest. He had feared this moment, feared the anger that would come when he failed yet again. But the memory of the Modoc warrior's compassion, his calm demeanor, his silent strength, kept him from backing down. "I brought you food, because that's what we need to survive. Whiskey won't help us stay alive. But this will." Billy's voice was stronger now, the words carrying more weight than he had ever allowed himself to say before. There was a long pause, a silence thick with the tension between them. His father stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the moment had drained him. "You're a fool, boy," he muttered under his breath. "But I suppose it's too late to turn back now. Give me that meat." Billy handed over the bundle, his hands still shaking, but this time it was not out of fear. It was out of something else, something he had never felt before. He felt the smallest flicker of hope, like a spark in the dark. The fire crackled loudly as his father began to cut into the meat, the sharp scent filling the air. For a moment, Billy allowed himself to feel the warmth of the fire, the first warmth he had felt in days. It was strange, almost impossible to believe that the same hands that had threatened him could now hold this food. As his father ate in silence, Billy turned away, staring out the window into the growing light of the morning. He felt a strange peace in his heart, something he hadn't known he was capable of. The Modoc had shown him the way. It was not through anger or violence that one could survive. It was through kindness, through generosity, and through strength of character. Billy didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if his father would ever change, or if the harsh reality of their world would swallow them whole. But for the first time, Billy believed that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to survive, one that didn't require sacrificing everything in the name of survival. And with that, as the fire warmed his skin and the meat filled his stomach, Billy made a promise to himself. No matter what, he would never forget the Modoc warrior and the lesson he had taught him, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what we take, but in what we give. The days following Billy's return from the Modoc warrior's camp were quiet, but the weight of his encounter with the stranger lingered in his mind. The fire in the hearth flickered softly, casting shadows across the walls of the small cabin. Billy's father had not spoken much since he reluctantly accepted the venison Billy had brought, but there was an unspoken change in the air, a shift in something deeper than their harsh routines. Billy didn't know if his father had changed, or if he was just too tired to argue anymore, but it felt different. For the first time in a long while, there was a strange sense of peace in the cabin, even if it was only temporary. Billy spent the days after in silence, focusing on the small tasks that needed to be done, chopping wood, fixing the broken fence, and checking the traps his father had set. His hands were steady as he worked, but his mind often wandered back to that brief moment in the Modoc warrior's camp. The man's calm demeanor, his quiet strength, and his unexpected kindness had left a deep impression on Billy. He kept thinking about the Modoc's words, the way he had offered food without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. It had been a gesture of humanity in a world that often felt devoid of it. One morning, as Billy stepped outside to fetch water from the nearby stream, he caught sight of something unexpected, a figure on horseback, moving slowly across the horizon. The figure was tall, with a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and from the distance, Billy couldn't make out who it was. His heart skipped a beat. Was it another stranger, someone like the Modoc warrior, or was it someone dangerous? As the figure grew closer, Billy could see the familiar outline of a man he hadn't seen in years, a man who had been part of his past. It was the same Modoc warrior who had shared his last deer meat. The man's horse slowed to a stop as he approached Billy, and for a moment, the two simply stared at each other. The warrior's eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to measure Billy in a way that made him feel exposed. "I see you've made it back," the warrior said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that Billy couldn't quite understand. "Your father still lives, I see. But you—" He paused, looking at Billy with a knowing expression. "You're different. I can see it." Billy didn't know how to respond. He felt as though he had already said everything when he first left the Modoc warrior's camp. But the warrior's presence now, standing in front of him, seemed to bring everything to a head. "Why are you here?" Billy asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The warrior glanced back at the cabin, his face unreadable. "I've been thinking about you, boy," he said softly, "and about the world you live in. You carry a weight on your shoulders that most will never understand. But you have a choice." Billy swallowed hard. The warrior's words stirred something deep inside him, a fear that he was stuck in a life that was slowly crushing him, a life of survival and submission. He looked down at his feet, unsure of what to say next. "What kind of choice?" Billy finally asked. The warrior dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked closer to Billy. "You can continue down the same path you've been on," he said, "and live your life in the shadow of your father's cruelty. Or you can choose a different way. There is strength in kindness, in mercy. You have seen it." Billy thought of the venison, the act of kindness that had saved his life that night. He thought of how the warrior had shared his last bit of food without hesitation, how it had felt to be given something without any expectation of return. The idea of that kind of strength that wasn't about power or domination, was foreign to him, but it was a kind of strength he found himself craving. "But my father," Billy began, his voice trembling. "He will never change. He will never let me leave." The warrior placed a hand on Billy's shoulder, steadying him. "That may be true," he said, "but you can choose to walk away from his influence. You do not have to carry his burdens." The Modoc warrior looked out at the horizon, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I know the world you live in. I know the weight of survival. But I also know that there is more to life than simply surviving." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You have the power to change your path, Billy. It will not be easy, but it is your choice." Billy stood there, processing the warrior's words. A part of him wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that he could change his life, but another part was too afraid of what it would mean. He had never known anything other than the constant struggle to survive. The idea of something better felt impossible. "What should I do?" Billy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The warrior's face softened, and for the first time, Billy saw a glimmer of something like compassion in his eyes. "You should follow your heart," the warrior said gently. "You should choose the path that calls to you, even if it scares you." With that, the Modoc warrior turned and mounted his horse, his figure disappearing into the distance as quickly as he had arrived. Billy stood there for a long time, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in his chest. He didn't know what he would do, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The days after the Modoc warrior's visit seemed to stretch endlessly for Billy. He woke each morning to the same cold, silent cabin, the same quiet tension in the air. His father, though still distant and brooding, had made no move to stop him from going about his work. It was as if the warrior's words had created a shift, a crack in the hardened shell of his father's indifference. But Billy knew that change, if it came, would be slow and uncertain. The cabin felt colder now, not because of the temperature, but because Billy's heart was at odds with the life he had been forced to live. The warrior's offer still echoed in his mind, and it was like a door that had been opened just a crack. But Billy wasn't sure how to walk through it. His father had never shown him kindness. There had always been work, harsh words, and survival. His life was a constant battle, and the idea of something more, a life of compassion, of choice, felt like a dream that was too far away. One morning, as Billy was splitting firewood outside, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. His heart skipped. He wiped his brow and turned, squinting into the bright sun. A figure was riding toward him, silhouetted against the horizon. As the rider came closer, Billy's breath caught. It was the Modoc warrior again. Billy's heart raced. What was he doing here? Had he come to take Billy away, as he had suggested before? Or was he just passing through again? The warrior slowed his horse to a trot and stopped in front of Billy. He looked down at the boy with a quiet intensity, his eyes never leaving Billy's. "I see you are still here," the warrior said, his voice calm and measured. Billy nodded, unsure of what to say. "I didn't leave," Billy muttered. I don't know if I can." The warrior's gaze softened, and he dismounted. "You don't have to decide right now," he said. "But you should know that the path you walk now is not the only one you can follow. There is always a choice, even in the hardest times." Billy's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can leave my father. He'll never understand. He needs me here." The warrior stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Billy's shoulder. "You don't need to carry his burdens, boy. You have your own life to live. You do not need to live in his shadow." Billy felt the weight of the warrior's words like a stone in his chest. His father had always been the center of his world, and the idea of leaving him behind, of choosing something else, seemed impossible. "But what if I leave and something happens to him?" Billy asked, his voice barely a whisper. The warrior's face remained calm, but his eyes seemed to see straight through Billy. "What will happen to you, boy, if you stay?" Billy was silent for a long moment, his thoughts churning. The warrior's question struck deep. He had always stayed, always done what was expected of him, but at what cost? He thought of the days spent working, of the endless cycle of survival and submission. He thought of the Modoc warrior, who had found strength in kindness, and the quiet power that came from choosing a different way. Billy felt a stirring in his chest, a small, fragile spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than just his father's shadow. "What should I do?" Billy asked, his voice shaky. The warrior studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Then, he spoke again, his voice firm and sure. "You should take the path that is yours, Billy. The one that leads to your own future, not the one forced on you. The world is bigger than just this cabin. You have to believe that. You must walk that path, no matter how difficult it may seem." The warrior mounted his horse once more, preparing to leave. "You know where to find me if you choose differently." Billy stood there, watching the warrior ride off into the distance, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. The sun was high in the sky now, and the day was warming up, but inside Billy, it felt like the first spring thaw. His thoughts were still a tangled mess, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he could take a step towards something else. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he knew he had to find it. As the warrior disappeared from view, Billy turned back toward the cabin. His father would be inside, probably waiting for him to finish the work that was never done. But something had changed in Billy. Something deep inside him had been unlocked, and now he knew he had a choice. A choice that could lead him out of the cold and into something he had never dared to believe in: freedom, peace, and perhaps even hope. As the days passed, Billy found himself torn between the life he had always known and the new possibility that had begun to stir in his heart. The Modoc warrior's words lingered in his mind like a quiet, persistent echo. "You must walk that path, no matter how difficult it may seem." Billy hadn't made any decisions yet, but every moment, every breath, seemed to draw him closer to a choice he never thought he would face. The tension between his desire for something more and his fear of what would happen if he left kept him awake at night, staring up at the rafters of the cabin. He still hadn't told his father about the warrior's visit. The thought of leaving, even if only for a short time, seemed impossible. His father needed him, or so he told himself. The days blended together. It was winter, and the harsh winds made the chores harder than ever. Billy went through the motions, chopping wood, mending fences, feeding the animals, but his mind was elsewhere. He spent more and more time by the creek, standing alone by the frozen water, staring out at the vast expanse of wilderness. He thought of the Modoc warrior, of the man who had chosen a different path, a path of kindness and strength. Billy had felt something shift inside him when he'd heard those words. It was as if a door had been opened, and now he couldn't ignore what lay beyond it. He had always believed that survival was the only thing that mattered, but the warrior had shown him that there was more. There was a way to live, to be strong without cruelty. That thought kept him going, even as the weight of his situation pressed down on him. One cold afternoon, As Billy was carrying firewood back to the cabin, he heard the sound of hooves approaching once more. His heart skipped a beat. He turned and saw a familiar figure riding toward him, a lone rider, moving slowly but with purpose. It was the Modoc warrior again. Billy's chest tightened. What was he doing here this time? As the warrior drew near, he slowed his horse to a stop, his eyes meeting Billy's. There was no surprise in the warrior's gaze, only a quiet understanding. Billy swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "I've been thinking," Billy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what you said. About choosing a different path." The warrior nodded, his face softening slightly. "And?" he asked, as though he already knew the answer. Billy hesitated. He had never been good at making decisions, never been good at standing up for himself. His whole life had been about following orders, doing what was expected, surviving. But now, for the first time, he felt like he had the chance to choose something for himself. "I don't know if I can leave," Billy admitted, looking down at his boots. "I'm not sure what will happen if I do." The warrior's expression remained calm, but there was a firmness in his voice when he spoke. "You don't have to leave forever, Billy. But you must decide for yourself what kind of life you want. If you stay in this cabin, under your father's shadow, you will never truly be free. You must know that." Billy felt a sharp pang of truth in the warrior's words. The idea of leaving his father, of choosing a life that wasn't defined by fear and survival, felt like an impossible leap. But the more Billy thought about it, the more he realized that he had already taken the first step. The warrior had shown him that there was another way. "What do I do now?" Billy asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Do I just walk away from everything I've known?" The warrior's eyes softened. "You don't walk away, Billy. You walk toward something. Toward freedom. Toward a life that is yours to create. It won't be easy, but nothing worth having ever is." Billy stood in silence, his mind racing with possibilities. He thought of the days he had spent working alongside his father, of the coldness and the harshness of their life. He thought of the warrior's kindness, of the strength in choosing mercy over brutality. And for the first time, he wondered if he could live like that. He looked up at the warrior, a sense of determination beginning to form inside him. "I think I want that," Billy said, his voice steady now. "I think I want to choose my own path." The warrior smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Then you have already taken the hardest step," he said. "The rest will come in time." Billy's heart beat faster as the warrior turned his horse and began to ride away. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he could choose it. As the warrior disappeared into the distance, Billy stood there for a long moment, watching the horizon. The wind had started to die down, and the air felt clearer somehow, lighter. It was as if the weight that had always hung over him was slowly beginning to lift. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He was no longer bound by the life he had always known. The path ahead was his to choose, and that was enough for now. It was the beginning of the next week when Billy finally made the decision he knew would change his life forever. He could feel the weight of it, heavy in his chest, as he spent the morning sharpening the axe his father had given him, a task he had done countless times. But today was different. The sharp edge of the blade glinted in the early morning sun, and Billy knew it wasn't just the axe he was preparing, it was his life. As he worked, his mind kept drifting back to the Modoc warrior's words. You must walk toward something. Toward freedom. That truth had been sitting with him like a stone in his chest, growing heavier as the days passed. He had come to a realization. He didn't just want a different life, he needed one. The life he had been living, defined by fear and survival, was not enough anymore. He needed a life where he could stand tall, where his actions could make a difference, and where he could be more than just a shadow. The decision was made, and now it was time to act. Billy's father was inside the cabin, his back turned as he worked near the fire. Billy could hear him muttering, the gruff sound of his voice filled with frustration, as it always was. He had no idea what was about to happen. Billy stood up and looked one last time at the small cabin that had been his home. The thought of leaving it behind felt like an impossible thing. But then he remembered the Modoc warrior, the kindness in his actions, the strength of his choices. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door. He was going to leave. He had no plan other than to follow his heart and the feeling deep inside him that urged him forward. As Billy opened the door, the cold air hit him with a sharp bite. He stepped outside, his boots crunching against the snow as he made his way toward the barn. He didn't want to leave without making sure everything was taken care of. There was something important to him in that barn. His horse, the one he had raised and cared for since it was a colt. He would need it to travel, to get far away from this place. As Billy opened the barn door, the familiar smell of hay and leather greeted him. His horse, a sturdy bay mare, was munching on the hay in the corner. Billy approached slowly, his heart pounding with each step. He could feel the fear creeping up inside him, the fear of the unknown, of leaving everything behind. But this was what he had to do. He couldn't stay here any longer. He reached out and gently stroked the horse's mane, whispering soft words of comfort to it. "It's time," he murmured. "We're going to be free." The horse nickered softly, as if it understood. Billy saddled the mare quickly, his hands steady despite the rush of emotions flooding through him. He was ready. As he mounted the horse and turned it toward the gate, he hesitated just for a moment, glancing back at the cabin one last time. His father would be angry, of course. He would never understand. But Billy couldn't live in that house of shadows anymore. He had made his choice. He dug his heels into the mare's sides, and the horse broke into a steady trot. As they moved further away from the cabin, Billy's heart began to lighten, the weight he had been carrying for so long starting to lift. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time, he felt alive, truly alive. His life was his own to shape now, and he would not waste it. The journey ahead would be difficult, no doubt. The wilderness was harsh, and there would be no guarantee of safety. But Billy had learned something important from the Modoc warrior. Kindness, mercy, and strength came not from what one had, but from what one chose to give. And that was the life Billy wanted. As the cabin disappeared from sight behind him, Billy urged the horse into a faster gait, the wind whipping through his hair and the cold air filling his lungs. He didn't know where the road would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. He was finally free. As Billy rode deeper into the wilderness, the cold wind nipped at his face, and the silence of the open plain seemed to stretch on forever. The rhythmic sound of his horse's hooves on the frozen earth was the only thing that broke the stillness. He had been riding for hours, the journey ahead uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was in control of his own fate. The farther he traveled, the more the weight of the past seemed to fall away, and the more he embraced the idea of a future that was his to choose. He thought of his father, of the cruel words that had been his constant companion for so long. He thought of the years of hard labor, of trying to survive in a world that seemed to offer nothing but struggle. But none of that mattered anymore. He was free now, free to decide what kind of life he wanted to lead. Billy had not planned where to go, but he knew he couldn't turn back. The road ahead was unknown, and it was filled with uncertainty, but he was willing to face it. The landscape around him was vast and wild, with snow-covered hills rising in the distance and the barren expanse of the plains stretching as far as the eye could see. There were dangers out here, of course, wild animals, the harsh winter, and the ever-present threat of being caught by someone from his past. But Billy wasn't afraid. He had survived the harshest of conditions before. What he feared now was the idea of going back to the life he had left behind. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, Billy spotted a small cluster of trees in the distance. He urged the horse forward, deciding to make camp for the night. It was a simple decision, but it felt like another small step toward the life he was trying to build. He knew he couldn't travel forever without rest. As he dismounted and began to gather wood for a fire, Billy's mind drifted back to the Modoc warrior. The man's strength, his calm in the face of danger, and the quiet wisdom in his words had left a lasting impression on Billy. He wondered what it would be like to live like that, to have the kind of peace that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. As Billy sat by the fire, the flames crackling and popping in the cold night air, he began to think about the future in a way he never had before. He wasn't sure what he would do or where he would go, but he knew he had to keep moving forward. There was no turning back to the life he had known, and he couldn't afford to let fear or doubt control him now. He had to keep pushing. As he sat in the flickering firelight, the warmth of the flames beginning to sink into his cold bones, he thought of the people he had left behind, the life that had been forced upon him. He thought of his father, of the anger and the bitterness that had shaped him. Billy had been a part of that world for so long, but he realized now that he was no longer bound by it. He was free. It was a freedom that came with a price. There would be challenges ahead, dangers he couldn't yet imagine. But there was also hope. Hope that he could build something better, something that was his own. He looked out at the dark horizon, the cold wind whispering through the trees. There was a new world out there for him, a world where he could choose his path. As the fire burned low, Billy lay down on the ground, wrapping himself in his blanket and staring up at the stars. They were clearer here, away from the smoke and dust of the settlement. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He didn't know where his journey would take him, but he knew he would face it with strength, with kindness, and with the belief that he could create a life of his own making. As he drifted off to sleep, the cold night wrapping around him like a shroud, he knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he was ready to walk it. As Billy continued his journey through the rugged wilderness, the world around him seemed to grow quieter with each passing day. The fire he had started to warm his hands and ease his thoughts had now burned down to a small, smoldering heap, and the stars above were the only light that guided him through the cold nights. There was no turning back. The path ahead, though uncertain, was his to walk. He had come too far to let fear or doubt dictate his steps. In the days that followed, Billy found himself growing accustomed to the solitude. The first few nights had been filled with anxiety, the silence oppressive, but now it felt more like a companion than a weight. He had no destination, no clear idea of where he was going, but each step seemed to take him further from the life he had left behind. His thoughts often returned to his father, to the harshness of that life. But the more Billy thought about it, the more he realized that the choice to leave had not been an act of rebellion. It had been an act of survival. He had to escape the world that had been built around him, or he would never know what it was like to truly live. As he ventured deeper into the wild, the terrain began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills and thick forests, and the air grew colder still. It was as if the land itself was testing him, pushing him to his limits. Billy welcomed it. The challenge felt like an old friend, one he had not seen in a long time. He had learned from the Modoc warrior that strength did not always come from force, but from perseverance, from the quiet moments when you chose to keep going, even when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. One afternoon, while riding through the dense woods, Billy heard the distant sound of horses approaching. His heart raced as he instinctively pulled his horse to the side of the trail, seeking cover in the trees. He didn't know who they were, but after days of solitude, any other people meant potential danger. He could hear the soft clip-clop of hooves and the murmur of voices. He held his breath, his heart thumping in his chest. The sound grew louder, and Billy's mind raced. He had never been good at dealing with strangers. His father had always been the one to handle the interactions, to keep the peace through force or fear. Billy had always stayed in the background, doing what was expected, never questioning it. But now, out here in the wilderness, he realized he was on his own. There was no one to protect him, no one to make decisions for him. If he was going to survive, he would have to face these moments head-on. As the riders came into view, Billy's breath caught in his throat. There were 4 of them, all riding at a slow pace, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. They were dressed in the rough, worn clothing of frontier men, their faces set in grim lines. They didn't look like the kind of men Billy could trust. But there was no turning back now. He couldn't hide forever. With his heart pounding in his chest, Billy urged his horse forward, stepping into the open trail. The riders stopped and looked at him, their eyes sharp and calculating. The silence between them was thick with tension, the kind of silence that came just before something big happened. Billy tried to steady his breath, his mind racing for what to do next. "What's a boy like you doing out here alone?" one of the men asked, his voice gruff. Billy's instincts told him to lie, to tell them he was just passing through, but something inside him told him that honesty was the only option now. "I'm traveling," Billy said, his voice firm. "I left my home behind. I'm on my own now." The men exchanged glances, sizing him up. "A runaway, huh?" Another man muttered. "You've got guts, boy, but guts won't get you far out here." Billy's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. "I'm not afraid," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The leader of the group, a tall man with a long scar running down his cheek, studied him for a moment before dismounting. "You'd better watch your back, kid," he said, his voice low and menacing. "The world out here's unforgiving. You don't belong in it. But if you want to live, you'll learn quick." Billy's chest tightened. He didn't know what kind of man this was, but there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. He had seen it in his father's eyes many times before. This was the kind of man who took what he wanted and didn't care who got hurt in the process. The men didn't wait for an answer. Without another word, they turned their horses around and began to ride off. Billy stood there, watching them go, the tension slowly draining from his body. His hands shook slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something that had been building inside him for days. As the riders disappeared into the distance, Billy realized that he had passed another test. He had faced the unknown, and he had stood his ground. This was no longer about running away from the past. It was about moving toward the future. And for the first time, Billy felt like he was finally moving in the right direction. The next few days passed in a blur, the wilderness surrounding Billy growing more and more familiar with each step. The initial uncertainty that had filled his heart with fear now seemed like a distant memory. Every path he walked, every decision he made, felt like a reaffirmation of the choice he had made to leave everything behind. His journey was no longer just about survival. It was about discovery, about finding out who he truly was beyond the life his father had imposed on him. But as the days stretched on, Billy knew he couldn't keep running forever. The thought of finding a place to settle, of carving out a new life, had started to take root in his mind. He had no family now, no ties to the past. He was a young man alone in a world full of possibilities and dangers. The freedom he had fought for still felt fragile, and deep down, he knew he had to be careful. The landscape around him had shifted again. The dense forest gave way to rocky terrain, and the air had a bite to it, a cold that hinted at the coming of winter. Billy's horse moved steadily under him, its hooves crunching over the gravel as they made their way up a narrow trail. The day was overcast, with the sun hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. Billy had heard the sound of rushing water ahead. There was a river nearby, he was sure of it. He had been following this trail for miles, hoping to find a safe place to rest, and possibly some shelter from the growing chill. As he approached the riverbank, Billy's eyes scanned the area. The rushing water was loud, but the surroundings were eerily quiet. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It felt like a place where no one had been for a long time. Billy dismounted and led his horse down to the river, feeling the cool air against his skin. The water was fast-moving, its surface swirling with the momentum of the current. He knelt down by the edge, cupping his hands to drink, but his attention was caught by something in the distance. A figure, a person. Billy froze, his heart skipping a beat. He wasn't sure if the figure had seen him yet, but there was no mistaking the shape of a person on horseback, moving slowly through the trees on the opposite side of the river. The figure was far enough away that Billy couldn't make out any details, but the presence of another person in this vast wilderness was enough to put him on edge. He stepped back, his mind racing. Could it be the men he had encountered earlier, the ones who had warned him? He didn't know, but he wasn't going to take any chances. He grabbed the reins of his horse and pulled it further into the cover of the trees, moving as quietly as he could. His heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline from the encounter with the riders still fresh in his mind. The figure across the river hadn't seen him, but Billy wasn't sure if they had heard him either. He watched from his hiding spot, eyes focused on the movement across the river, waiting for any sign of danger. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. The figure seemed to be unaware of Billy's presence, moving in the opposite direction, deeper into the woods. Eventually, the sound of the horse's hooves faded into the distance, and the riverbank grew silent once again. Billy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was still alive. He had avoided another confrontation, but the encounter had reminded him of something important. He was no longer a boy hiding in the shadow of his father's rules. He was a man making his own choices, but those choices came with consequences. The world out here was harsh and unforgiving, and Billy knew that no matter how much he wanted to believe otherwise, he was still vulnerable. As the evening approached, the cold air settled in, and Billy knew he had to keep moving. He couldn't stay in one place for too long. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. The wilderness might be beautiful, but it was also dangerous. Billy mounted his horse once more, his eyes scanning the surroundings as he set off along the river's edge. He knew he needed to find shelter for the night. The clouds above were thickening, and the wind was picking up. He had to find a safe place to rest before the weather turned. As he rode on, his mind was still occupied by the encounter. Who was that rider? Were they part of the same group of men he had met before, or was it someone else entirely? Billy didn't have answers, but he knew he couldn't keep dwelling on the unknown. The only thing he could control was his next move. He had chosen to leave the life he had known, to step into the unknown, and he couldn't let fear guide him now. The choice was his, and Billy was determined to see it through. The road ahead was still long, but he would keep moving forward. And no matter what happened, he would face it with the same strength and courage that had brought him this far. As the days passed, the weight of Billy's decision continued to settle in his chest. He had left the life he knew behind, and now the vast wilderness was both his freedom and his challenge. The journey ahead was still uncertain, and the further he went, the more he realized how much he was alone. The thought of facing this world without any guidance, without the harsh rules of his father to follow, brought both fear and excitement. He had chosen this path, and now he had to make it his own. It was a cold morning when Billy finally reached the base of the mountain he had been heading toward for days. He had heard whispers in the small towns along the way about a place where people could rebuild, a place where a man could start fresh. The prospect of a new life was more than just a distant dream. It was a beacon calling him forward. The mountain loomed large in front of him, its jagged edges cutting through the gray sky, a wild, untamed force that seemed as intimidating as it was majestic. Billy's heart beat faster as he urged his horse onward, the terrain growing rougher and the air colder as they climbed. His hands were stiff with cold, and the horse's steady hoofbeats echoed through the barren landscape. The mountain felt like an obstacle, but also a promise. He had no idea what awaited him at the top, but he was determined to find out. By midday, Billy reached a small clearing near a stream that ran along the foot of the mountain. He decided to make camp for the night, needing a rest after the long ride. The fire he built crackled in the cold air as he unpacked his supplies. Billy sat back against a large rock, staring into the flames. For a moment, his mind drifted back to the confrontation by the river, the encounter with the riders. He didn't know if they had been part of the same group he had met earlier, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't the only threat in this wilderness. Billy was learning that survival wasn't just about running from danger. It was about facing it head-on, making choices when no one else would. The fire warmed his hands as he rubbed them together, feeling the heat seep into his frozen bones. He had learned how to survive in this world, but there was more to it than that. He had to learn how to live. He thought about the Modoc warrior and his quiet strength, the way he had walked away from the past, choosing a life of peace over the violence that surrounded him. Billy knew he wasn't there yet, but that kind of strength called to him. He couldn't keep running from everything. He had to face the parts of himself he had been hiding, the fear that had always been with him. As the fire burned low and the night grew darker, Billy heard the sound of hooves in the distance. He stiffened, alert, instinctively reaching for the rifle strapped to his saddle. But as the rider came into view, Billy let out a quiet sigh of relief. It was just one person, another traveler, it seemed. The rider slowed as they approached the camp, and Billy stood up, trying to seem as casual as possible, though his heart was still racing. The rider stopped a few feet away, his horse snorting as it shifted its weight. The man was older than Billy, perhaps in his 30s, with a weathered face and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. His clothes were worn but functional, and he carried a rifle similar to Billy's. "You alone, kid?" the man asked, his voice low but not unfriendly. Billy nodded, trying to mask the unease he felt. "Yeah, just traveling through." The man studied him for a moment, then glanced around the camp, taking in the fire and the sparse supplies scattered about. "This place is dangerous for a boy traveling alone," the man said, his tone more serious now. "A lot of folks out here looking for an easy mark." Billy's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice steady. "I can handle myself," he said, not sure whether he was trying to convince the man or himself. The stranger gave a quiet chuckle. "I can tell, but even the toughest ones get caught off guard." He paused, as if considering something. "Name's Jack," he said, finally extending a hand. "I've been through here a few times. Might be you. Could use some company for the rest of your ride. It's a hard road, especially up that mountain." Billy looked at the man's hand, then up at his face, searching for any sign of deception. But there was nothing there. just the same weary look he had seen in other travelers. The look of someone who had been through the hardships of the land and survived. Billy hesitated for a moment, then shook his hand. "I'm Billy." The man smiled slightly, his eyes softening. "Well, Billy, it's good to meet you. Let's see what's out there together. There's safety in numbers." Billy wasn't sure whether it was the right decision, but he didn't want to turn down help, not in a world as unforgiving as this. He had learned that much already. Sometimes, even the strongest needed a hand. As the fire flickered between them, the night seemed to settle into a comfortable silence. The road ahead would be hard, but with Jack's help, Billy felt like he might just make it to the end of it, wherever that might be. And as the two of them sat in the quiet of the night, Billy realized that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand what it meant to truly live, not just survive. The next few days with Jack were a blur of constant movement and survival. They traveled together through dense forests and across open fields, the wind at their backs and the sky overhead growing darker as the days passed. Billy had never been this far from home, and he had never traveled with someone like Jack before. Jack had a way of talking about the world, about survival, that made everything seem easier, even when it was clear they were both struggling. They had learned to trust each other quickly. Jack wasn't like the other men Billy had met on his journey. He didn't try to intimidate or dominate. Instead, he gave Billy space, letting him make his own decisions while also sharing bits of wisdom when necessary. Billy had learned more from Jack in a few days than he ever had from his father. It wasn't just about survival. It was about how to approach the world, how to navigate the dangers without losing yourself in the process. One night, after a long day of riding, they found themselves in another small clearing. Jack started a fire, and Billy helped gather the wood. The crackling of the fire was a welcome sound, and the warmth it provided was a relief against the sharp bite of the mountain air. Billy sat down on a nearby rock, his eyes fixed on the flames. Jack handed him a tin cup of water, and for a moment, they both just sat there, the silence between them comfortable. "What do you think's up ahead?" Billy asked, breaking the stillness. Jack glanced at him, the firelight casting shadows on his weathered face. "More of the same. Hard travel, cold nights, dangers we'll face head-on." "You know that already," he said, taking a deep drink from his own cup. Billy nodded. It was true. Every day had been a test of endurance, of willpower. There was no soft road, no easy way out. "I'm in after this. After we get through this mountain." "What's next?" Billy pressed. Jack smiled faintly, looking up at the sky as if considering the question for the first time. "Next," he repeated. "Well, I reckon it's the same thing we've been doing. Keeping our heads up, trying to make our way, whatever that means. I've got no fancy plans. Just take it one step at a time." Billy couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. One step at a time. That had always sounded so simple, so manageable. But out here, it didn't always feel that way. He had no family waiting for him, no solid plans. Everything felt uncertain, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was drifting in a world that had no place for him. "You think I'll ever make something of myself out here?" Billy asked, his voice quieter now. Jack studied him for a moment, as if weighing his answer. "What do you want to make of yourself?" he asked after a beat. Billy thought about it for a moment, his eyes flicking to the fire. "I don't know," he said. "I guess I just want to be something more than what I've been. I want to stop feeling like I'm running from everything." Jack nodded slowly, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Ain't easy, kid. But if you want to be more than you've been, you've got to stop thinking about running and start thinking about walking forward. The past is a heavy load to carry. But it's just that, the past. You can't let it define you unless you want it to." Billy looked up at Jack, his words sinking deep into him. The weight of his past, his father's harshness, the life he had left behind, it all seemed so heavy. But Jack was right. He couldn't keep running from it. He had to walk forward, even if he didn't know exactly where that would take him. The fire crackled again, and the wind howled in the distance. Billy looked out into the dark, wondering if the path ahead would get any easier. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Billy admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack's expression softened, and he put a hand on Billy's shoulder. "Strength ain't about never being weak, kid. It's about picking yourself up when you fall. And it's about knowing that no matter how rough it gets, you've still got a choice. You've always had that choice." Billy didn't know what to say. He just nodded slowly, letting the words settle into his chest. The quiet between them was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like understanding. The night stretched on, the fire slowly dying down. Billy lay down to sleep, staring up at the stars. They were clear tonight, bright against the deep black sky. For the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet hope rise within him. Maybe it was the fire, or maybe it was Jack's words, but something inside him shifted. The journey ahead would be difficult, no doubt, but it was his to make. And with that thought, Billy closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. The days with Jack passed quickly as they continued their journey through the rugged wilderness. The pair moved forward with a shared understanding. Both had their reasons for traveling. Both had their own pasts to outrun, and both knew that survival in this harsh world required more than strength. It required resilience, a quality Billy had learned to tap into as he moved further away from the life he had left behind. Jack had a quiet confidence about him, and it was becoming clear that the older man had seen far more of the world than Billy had ever imagined. His calm presence gave Billy a sense of stability, even though they were far from civilization. Billy wasn't sure what he expected from Jack. Maybe it was a form of mentorship, or perhaps just someone who understood the unspoken weight of walking away from everything. Either way, the day spent with Jack had given Billy something he hadn't had in a long time, a sense of purpose. One late afternoon, after a long day of traveling, they stopped to rest at the edge of a dense forest, where the sunlight filtered through the trees in soft rays. Billy sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting as he stared into the flames. Jack was busy tending to the horses, but Billy couldn't shake the feeling that he was at a crossroads, that he was on the brink of something important. The future felt like an open road, but it was one he hadn't yet found the courage to fully walk down. "What do you think comes after all this?" Billy asked, his voice quiet but filled with a certain curiosity. Jack didn't immediately answer. He finished securing the horses and then walked over to the fire, sitting down beside Billy. "You mean after the mountain? After this journey?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. Billy nodded, his eyes not leaving the flames. "Yeah. What's the point of all this if we don't know what's waiting for us on the other side?" Jack was silent for a moment, then spoke in his slow, deliberate way. "The point isn't always to know what's waiting, Billy. Sometimes the point is in just making the choice to keep going, even when you don't know the outcome." Billy looked up at Jack, trying to grasp the meaning behind his words. "So, you're saying there's no destination? No real goal?" Jack smiled, but it was a knowing smile. "The goal is what you make of it. You want to know what comes after? It's whatever you choose. That's the beauty of it. No one else gets to tell you where you go next. Only you do." Billy felt a weight in his chest, a mixture of uncertainty and excitement. He had spent his whole life following the orders of others, his father, society, the harsh conditions of the world. But now, as he sat by the fire with Jack, it was becoming clear that he had more control over his life than he had ever realized. "I don't know what I want," Billy admitted, his voice quiet. Jack looked at him, his eyes sharp and understanding. "You don't have to know everything, Billy. No one does. Just make the next choice, and let the road take you from there." Billy sat back, taking in Jack's words. He had never thought of life this way. No clear answers, no straight path to follow, just a series of choices that shaped the future. The more he thought about it, the more liberating it felt. The road ahead wasn't just about survival. It was about living in a way that was true to himself. It was about facing each day with the knowledge that the future was his to create. That night, as the fire flickered low and the stars filled the sky, Billy made a silent promise to himself. He would keep moving forward, even if he didn't know exactly where he was headed. He would keep making choices that brought him closer to the life he wanted, the life he was meant to have. The next morning, they packed up and resumed their journey. The road grew steeper as they neared the base of the mountain. Jack's experience was evident in the way he moved. Calm, collected, never rushing. Billy followed his lead, taking each step with care. As they ascended the mountain, the air grew thinner, and the landscape around them became more rugged. The towering peaks above them loomed like silent sentinels, reminding Billy of just how small he was in the grand scheme of things. But as they climbed higher, Billy realized something important. The mountain wasn't something to fear. It was something to be conquered, just like the doubts and fears he had carried with him all his life. It was a challenge, yes, but it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to prove to himself that he was more than the boy who had once run away from home. By midday, they reached a small ridge that overlooked a valley below. Jack stopped, his eyes scanning the landscape. "This is a good spot to rest," he said, pulling the horses to a halt. Billy dismounted, feeling the strain of the climb in his legs, but also a sense of accomplishment. As he stood on the ridge, looking out at the vast expanse of land before him, he felt something shift inside. He had faced his fears, taken the first steps toward a new life, and now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was truly free. The mountain, the journey, and even the uncertainty ahead, they were all part of his path. And Billy was finally ready to walk it. As the days wore on, Billy and Jack continued their journey through the rugged mountain terrain. The challenge of the climb was not just physical, it was mental, a test of their endurance and their resolve. The higher they went, the thinner the air became, and with each step, the weight of the past seemed to lift from Billy's shoulders. The peaks stretched above them, silent and immense, and as Billy trudged forward, he realized that this was no longer just a journey to escape. This was a journey to find himself. He had learned so much from Jack over the past days. The importance of patience, of choosing the right moments to act, of understanding that the road to survival wasn't always about brute force, but about making wise choices, one step at a time. Every decision Billy made felt more intentional now. He wasn't the same scared boy who had run away from home. He had become someone stronger, someone who had begun to realize the power of his own choices. Jack had been a steady presence in his life, someone who didn't try to force his beliefs or decisions on Billy, but instead allowed him to come to his own conclusions. But now, standing on the mountain, Billy knew he couldn't rely on Jack forever. He had to find his own way. The moment that had changed everything was when Billy had stopped thinking of himself as just a survivor. He had started to think of himself as someone who could build a future, even in this harsh world. That thought had changed him. It was no longer enough just to exist. He wanted to live, to make something of himself in a world that had been unkind to him. As they reached the summit of the mountain, the view stretched out before them, a vast expanse of snow-covered plains and jagged ridges, the land rolling out endlessly. Billy felt small in comparison, but for the first time, he didn't feel insignificant. He felt a deep connection to the land, to the vastness of it, as if the very earth was telling him that this was where he was meant to be. Jack stood beside him, looking out over the horizon. "This is it, kid," he said quietly. "This is where the path you've been on leads. It's not always going to be easy, but you've got what it takes to make it." Billy didn't answer right away. He was still taking in the sight before him, the realization sinking in that the world was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. There was no going back. The past was behind him, and ahead lay an endless horizon. He felt a spark of excitement at the thought of the future, at the possibility of shaping his own destiny. He turned to Jack, who was still watching him closely. "What now?" Billy asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. Jack smiled, his weathered face softening. "Now you walk. You keep walking toward whatever it is you want, and you don't let anyone or anything stop you." Billy's chest tightened with a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. It was hard to imagine how he could move forward alone, but Jack's words had given him something he had never known: hope. "Thanks," Billy said simply, unsure of what else to say. Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't mention it. You're ready." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant call of birds. Billy stood tall, his eyes scanning the land in front of him, imagining all the possibilities. The weight of his past, of his father's cruelty, no longer had a hold on him. It was a part of him, yes, but it didn't define him anymore. He was no longer just a boy running from something. He was a young man walking toward something. And for the first time, Billy felt a quiet peace inside himself, as if everything, his choices, his journey, had led him to this moment. He knew the road ahead would not always be easy. There would be hardships, moments when he would doubt himself. But he had made the decision to take control of his life, to choose his own path, and that was the most powerful thing he could do. As he looked at Jack one last time, Billy nodded. "I'll keep walking." Jack gave him a nod in return, and without another word, turned and mounted his horse. Billy watched as Jack rode off into the distance, his figure growing smaller with each passing moment. And then, for the first time since he had left, Billy felt truly alone, not in the way he once had, with fear and uncertainty clinging to him, but in a way that was freeing. He could go wherever he chose now. The world was wide open, and Billy had the strength to face it. With that, he turned his horse around and began to ride forward, the wind at his back and the open road ahead. He didn't know where the journey would take him, but he was ready for it. He was ready to make his own destiny. Immerse yourself in this gripping tale of survival and self-discovery, where Billy, a young man escaping a harsh past, embarks on a journey through the unforgiving wilderness. Along the way, he encounters the strength of the land, the challenges of being alone, and the wisdom of a seasoned traveler who shows him that true strength comes not from running from the past, but from confronting it. This adventure is a reflection of the raw and powerful nature of Western stories, where each decision made on the road is a step towards finding one's true self. As Billy faces danger, meets strangers, and learns the meaning of survival, the narrative unfolds in a landscape both beautiful and brutal, much like the classic Western stories that shaped the genre. His journey isn't just about physical endurance, but about the emotional journey of growing stronger, facing fears, and carving out a new future. These Western stories are full of heart and hardship, and Billy's tale is no exception. Whether he's confronting dangerous strangers or reflecting on his past, each moment pushes him further toward understanding what it means to truly live in the wild and what it takes to build a new life. The grit and determination that define Western stories are evident in Billy's choices as he moves forward, unsure of what awaits, but confident in his own ability to face whatever comes next. As Billy's journey comes full circle, he steps into the unknown, leaving behind the limitations of his past and embracing the expansive future, a true testament to the timeless allure of Western stories.